the law clinic at Loyola Law School, and I've been lucky enough to be a clinic faculty member for coming up on close to 15 years, I think. So before I start, I really want to give a shout out to the students who have organized an incredible and very inspiring day. The leadership and members from BALSA, from the Loyola Law Review, and from the Loyola Journal of Public Interest. I think in all of my years here at Loyola, I have never seen a program that pulls these issues together, the intersectionality, that tackles structural racism, the problems with the foundations of our law, just as thoroughly and meaningfully as this program has done. So a shout out to all the students and faculty who have collaborated to put together an incredible program and bring in incredible speakers from all around. It's my pleasure and joy to be part of this program. And without further ado, I'll do some introductions. And if it's okay with the panelists, I'm going to introduce everyone all together. And then each panelist will talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll leave the last half hour, hopefully 4:30 to 5 o'clock, for questions from the audience and from the students. I'll go ahead and start with Derwyn Bunton, Attorney Bunton. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you again on Zoom. Derwyn is just known as a hero in our community for public defense and juvenile defense. As you probably know, he's the chief district defender in Orleans Parish and has been leading the Orleans Public Defender's Office for a number of years. Prior to becoming chief defender, Mr. Bunton was the ED of Juvenile Regional Services, which was the first then standalone juvenile defender office in the country. He's the former associate director of JJPL, a nonprofit juvenile justice reform and advocacy organization. And I really want to direct your attention to his formal bio for the incredible work he's done. What I want to say is we all know that Derwyn Bunton is a person who gets things done for justice every day. He's a person our community counts on. He's a person our clients count on, who lawyers around the city, around the region, around the country count on to carry justice forward in New Orleans. And if I'm making it sound like he's heroic, it's because we think he is. So thank you so much for being with us here, Derwyn Bunton, today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll next introduce Frank Southall. Frank, hi Frank, great to see you again. I have the pleasure of working with Frank on a regular basis on the housing justice work that we get to collaborate on. Frank is the lead organizer and community engagement coordinator of Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative. Jane Place is a groundbreaking and unique organization that pulls together renters' rights and a community land trust model to actually build affordable housing here in New Orleans. And those of us who work in the housing justice community and the social justice community count on Frank for his talents and creativity and passion as an organizer. As I said, he's the league organizer. He manages community engagement strategies. His primary a disciplined, well-organized, and impactful protest, as he's done in years past. He has an incredible passion for housing justice and public health and digital engagement. So Frank, thank you so much for being with us. It's great to see you. And finally, I'll introduce Reverend Gregory Manning, who you probably all know. He brings an incredible passion to the justice work he does. He runs the ministry of Broadmoor Community Church, handles community organizing, consistently works to fight to dismantle systemic racism on all fronts. He's regularly in the news for his social justice work, and I am personally inspired by the work he's done to raise the profile of issues that impact the homeless community here in New Orleans. I think it was around this time last year when he was sleeping out in Duncan Plaza to raise awareness to the incredible and urgent needs for long-term housing for our homeless community. And he brings together a passion for climate action and faith, and has inspired us with the work he's done around environmental justice in different places in the state. Of course, we know him as co-moderator of the Justice and Beyond, which is a broad coalition of activists and organizations that advocate for equity and justice. He's the founder and chair of the Greater New Orleans Interfaith Climate Coalition, and he's been a facilitator for the critical work of the Coalition Against Death Alley. Again, please direct your attention to the formal bios because we literally could spend the entire hour talking about the accomplishments of the panelists with us here today in the closing panel for the symposium. Unfortunately, our two panelists who were going to focus on education are unable to join us. So hopefully Derwyn Bunton won't mind that I'm gonna ask him to also address some issues of the school to prison pipeline and that he can address so well from his work with the juvenile population he served. So I hope I've given proper credit to our panelists. And without taking up any more time here with introductions, I will turn things over to Derwyn Bunton, Attorney Derwyn Bunton, to kick us off here today.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Finger. That was a much better introduction than I probably deserve, but I'm very, very thankful for all the work that you do and you do with the law school, and everyone here with the symposium has been so incredibly impressive as well. There's been a lot of speakers today who were absolutely magnificent, and so I had thought about putting together a PowerPoint, and then I saw who was on the docket, and I'm like, I'm not going to add to the PowerPoint industrial complex, but I am, I do have a few notes, and what I really wanted to focus on, in light of the other presentations today, I wanted to really talk about the criminal legal system as we're talking about structural racism. The criminal legal system as an expression of dominant political community values. And right now, the folks who dominate our political scene are also infected by this history of racism and structural racism. And whoever controls our political machinery controls our criminal legal system. So if the political machinery is infected with systemic and structural racism, then so will our criminal legal system be infected, and it is. And in this vein, I want to focus on what we call criminal, how we enforce those laws, what we criminalize, and how we enforce has major implications for people in our community. Our criminal legal system is now so big and far-reaching. We need deliberate leadership focused on equity, fairness, and a commitment to first do no harm. So I want to give 3 examples of criminal law and criminal law enforcement as expressions of dominant political power, really systemic racism, racist political power. So the one I want to talk about is the death penalty. So executions, but specifically executions of African Americans for rape. Now, rape is no longer a capital crime, and that is by virtue of the Supreme Court in a very close decision that came from Louisiana. And that case is Kennedy versus Louisiana, I do believe. But between 1930 and 1972, there were 455 people executed for rape. 405 of those executions were Black men, 89%. And 97% of those executions were carried out in Confederate states, the old Confederacy. No white man has ever been executed for a non-homicide rape of an African-American woman or child. Now, one could take those facts and argue that what we're expressing in that kind of enforcement, right? Because it doesn't say rape is illegal just for Black men, it says rape is illegal. But one could argue that there was a fear of African-American male sexuality or African-American African-American men generally, or trying to discourage, reproduction in some way, or hanging out with other women, or other folks uh, uh, in our communities. It's a scary fact to have such a huge disparity. My second example is my favorite criminal law. It is illegal possession of a handgun by a juvenile. And it is my favorite criminal law. It sounds like a good idea, right? You don't want kids with guns in their hands. That sounds great, right? Except when you read the law, we have written 7 affirmative defenses into the law, right? So before you even get started, we didn't want anybody to get it twisted. We wanted to, we wanted to say kids can't have guns except, right? And so one is if you're attending a hunter's safety course or firearms safety course. I don't know how many hunters use handguns in the deer blind, but whatever. Engaging in practice in the use of a firearm, like target shooting, hunting or trapping pursuant to a valid license, traveling to or from any activity that I just described. And here's where it gets fun. On real property with permission of the parent or legal guardian, and with the permission of the owner or lessee of the property, at such person's residence, and who, with the permission of such person's parent or legal guardian, you can have a gun, or with written permission of such person's parent or legal guardian, provided that such person carries on his person a copy of such written permission. So a note from your parents can let you have a handgun. So what does that say about what we value, right? What that says is we value our guns. Like yeah, it's bad if kids have guns, but we really like guns. And so we're going to make it so you can't just grab a kid and put them in jail for a gun. And I have had daydreams of putting my daughter, who just turned 13, on our front porch with a pistol and having the police ride by and say, "Hey, little girl, you've got a pistol." And my daughter saying, "No, it's okay. My dad said I can have it. He owns this house and I have his permission." That sounds just kind of ridiculous to me, but it is, in fact, what we see in our law. My final example is in detention, how we decide who is dangerous. And I want to focus on juvenile detention. Right now, 100% of the children in juvenile detention, in our juvenile jail, are African-American children, are Black children. 100% of the children on in-home and community supervision are Black children. And 100% of the children in New Orleans are not Black children, if you want to know the stats, but only Black children go to jail. Now, I often joke, imagine if NOPD, if Superintendent Ferguson said there is a problem with drugs in our schools, and took a bunch of, had a tipster and took a bunch of canines into Newman. Newman is the very expensive private school here in New Orleans, and just sniffed up and down the lockers looking for contraband, drugs, alcohol, whatever. One, that's never going to happen, right? But two, if he did, he wouldn't be superintendent for long. And that's because our laws, they tell us what we fear, what we value, what we believe is dangerous. And that has real implications for our system. And now that all feeds into what our system is and why we need the deliberate change focused on equity, fairness, and do no harm. We have a user pay criminal legal system in Louisiana. What that means is we depend disproportionately on people going through the system to pay for our criminal legal system. On average, 2/3 of public defender budgets, for example, depend on the fines and fees and costs paid by people going through the system. Now, this is not a system of universal application. The criminal legal system does not touch everybody equally. It is aimed at and designed to go after our poorest folks. It just is, and has been. And so when you look at that structure, you understand that the structural racism we confront is really baked in. And to narrate for you, if you are arrested in Louisiana and in New Orleans, um, you'll go in front of a judge, and they'll make a determination on whether or not you get a public defender. Now, that depends, of course, on how much money you have or don't have. 85% of the folks going through the criminal legal system will be assigned to my office. There was a study done by the Vera Institute some years ago that said, in actuality, by law, about 95% of the folks who go through would be eligible for our services. But the first thing that happens is when you're declared indigent, when you're declared too poor to afford an attorney, you'll get assigned my office, and immediately by law, you owe the public defender's office $40. That's the administrative fee. Then, of course, a bond is going to be set, and that's more fees. If you make that bond, there's a piece of that bond that goes to the public defender's office, the sheriff, the DA, and the court. Now, as you work your way through with your case, if you are found guilty or plead guilty, you owe our office another $45. That's the public defender fee. You will also be hit with a number of court costs and fees. There's a fee for felonies, there's a fee for misdemeanors, and then there's going to be money to the judicial expense fund, maybe. So those are more fees. And if you listen closely, particularly when it comes to public defenders, which is the part of the system designed to protect innocence, fight for clients, and hold power accountable, if you listen closely, you understand that structurally, the public defender's office is paid to lose. That is, there's a $45 fee if you are found guilty or plead guilty. So it stands to reason when we confront our clients in our community, they are not unreasonable in being upset to say, you work for the government, you get paid if I go to jail, because that is literally true. It takes a lot of time to break down that wall and build the rapport, to talk about how we run our office differently. That is not an incentive in our office. You're not promoted by the number of pleas you can get. But it is written into the law. We are paid to lose. And that is not lost on community. That's where we need to begin to unravel this sort of system. And I guarantee you, we would not be paid to lose if our clients looked different. I think the structure would be different if our clients were not poor Black and brown folks in New Orleans. If they were not poor Black and brown folks in Louisiana. And we're going to need real change, and we're going to need it from the ground up. And I will tell you why by framing this discussion around the latest case from our Supreme Court on public defense. And really, it's an indictment of our criminal legal system. State v. Covington is the case. And in State v. Covington, the Baton Rouge Public Defender's Office drew a line in the sand and said, ethically, we cannot continue to represent these people. We have to push back and decline some of these cases because we simply don't have the resources to meet them according to standard. And yes, there are standards for representing poor people. And the public defender, like I said, drew a line. It was litigated. The First Circuit, one of the most conservative in Louisiana, sided with the public defender and said, you know what, you are right. That decision was appealed, and the Supreme Court reversed, saying that you can't do that wholesale. You have to go case by case by case to prove whether or not you are ineffective, whether or not you are failing in terms of your representation of your client. Now, what that means is um, you'd have to take 25 for our office, you'd have to take 25,000 individual cases and write a motion and say, I don't have the resources I need. And then there would be 25,000 hearings stating for you to prove whether or not that is true. It is an absolute waste of time. But more than that, what they said was the evidence provided that the public defender's office in Baton Rouge was not providing competent, effective counsel was not compelling. And the evidence that they confronted included lawyers who did not have access to computers. It included high caseloads, high serious caseloads for lawyers in Baton Rouge by the hundreds that they were asked to manage. It also included a ratio of one investigator for every 12,000 cases in their office. And our Supreme Court said it was not compelling. What I wrote in response to a leadership listserv for our National Association for Public Defense, which I chair, I'm going to share with you now. And what I wrote to the listserv was, if you ever wonder how systemic racism, inequality, and injustice propagate, simply read this decision. At its core, this decision stands for at least three ugly propositions. One, poor people only deserve what the wealthy, well-connected, and powerful are willing to give them. Justice is relative and rationed for poor, Black, and brown people and communities. Justice really seems to depend on the amount of money in your account. Two, public defense as a profession is a standardless practice. Ethics and professional standards must yield to process. Indeed, according to the Louisiana Supreme Court, standards are too hard to trust or define. This thinking allows the court to see one investigator for 12,000 cases, but still find no convincing evidence of harm to people. Finally, Black and brown people remain second class in our legal system. To quote Chief Justice Johnson's scathing dissent, there is no equal justice under law when an innocent poor man is assigned a lawyer who doesn't even have adequate access to a computer, but a guilty rich man can purchase an entire legal team who will secure his acquittal. We have much work to do. Those are the stakes. Going to jail because it was never equitable to begin with. It was designed for poor people to fail at its inception. And to get to the piece that was dropped on me by Davida, which is the school to prison pipeline, most of our cases are for folks between the ages of 17 and 35. Nearly all our work is in that age range, with the most active being 17 to 25. And I began my work as a juvenile justice advocate and reformer. And I can tell you that we really need change at the juvenile justice level because, and a lot of this was talked about with Chris Henning's presentation prior, because of the fear, and our detention statistics show it, the fear of young Black and brown kids. And the idea that the way you deal with issues that come up in the classroom is by calling the school resource officer. That the way you deal with problems in the classroom or in the school is by referring them to law enforcement. I have a great friend who is a public defender in Miami. And she has been, she says, I've been broke all my life so that I could send my kids to private school. And she says, I send my kids to private school so that when something goes wrong, I get the call and not the police. And that is the best way I can think of to sum up what goes on that funnels some of our kids to our criminal legal system. And it is, again, a part of the political expression, how we enforce these the laws we have on the books. I do not believe 100% of the crime being committed in the streets is Black children. I think that 100% of the crime being detected, being enforced, is Black children, and therefore 100% of our detentions are Black children in our city. So I look forward to having a bigger discussion about this, because I really don't want to tread over a lot of the good work that has been done throughout the symposium talking about collateral consequences and other implications. But I did want to highlight a different lens, which is our criminal legal system really is, and this is what we need to reorient, an expression, an expression of whatever the dominant political expression is in our community. And that's where the work really needs to get deep and make some change.
Thank you so much, Derwyn Bunton, for your sobering thoughts, building, of course, on our previous panel on structural racism in the criminal justice system as a whole. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to Frank Southall. Frank, great, there you are. And there are some questions coming in. I just want to recognize that I see them, but before we go to questions, we're going to hear from each of our panelists. So Frank, take it away for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll turn to Reverend Manning.
Awesome. First, I just want to say thank you all for having me. This is such a great honor to be here with y'all, to be discussing these critical issues, and also to hear from other folks doing critical work around structural racism. So I think for me, when the question is asked, how does structural racism show up in housing? I think it's the root of our economic system, our economic, social, and political system. It's the reason why we exist as a country. In order for us to exist as a country, in order for me to be speaking, communicating English, what had to happen was the stealing of land, the dispossession of people of their land, the stealing of people from Africa to engage in slave labor. So I want to start from there, that we really have to think critically about land and how it's connected to everything. You know, as a species, the land that we live in dictate our culture. It can dictate our religion. It can dictate our ancestral tracks. So we have to really think about how land is so central to everything. So to have any discussion about white supremacy or patriarchy or whatever system of exploitation, you have to talk about land, and of course, housing. So I really want to do like a land acknowledgement, and it's something I went to a really amazing exhibit that Shana Griffin, who's one of our co-founders of the Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative, that she has currently at the CAC. I definitely recommend you go to it. And she has this really interesting piece about the whole concept of Balbuncha. For those of y'all don't know, Balbuncha refers to, it's a indigenous term that refer to the land that we're currently sitting on, now known as New Orleans. A lot of times, a lot of progressives want to go like, this is Balbuncha. But one of the interesting things that Shana makes, and I hope I'm doing justice, she's so brilliant, so you'll have to hear from her. But she talks about how like Balbuncha was a moment in time. In the colonialization, the bringing of enslaved labor to build the city, that's what became New Orleans. And so when we don't acknowledge it, there's these two moments in time, it kind of like erases the aspect of white supremacy and colonization. You know, and it's really interesting to think about that. Like, what made New Orleans New Orleans? Is slave labor, economic exploitation of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, you know, all sorts of immigrants who came here and who were exploited in their labor, you know, after slavery. Um, so yeah, so just really wanted to acknowledge that, to really think about land and where we're at. Um, Three other things I think that are really interesting with there's discussions about housing and land when it comes to discussions of educated groups of people. I feel like there's like sort of like three cliches of how people feel. One, people generally go like, it's the market. It's the market. The market does what it does. Um, you know, we live on a planet with like over 180 countries, and they all have wildly different ways that they do housing and the way they use land. So to say it's just a market is BS. The market is not some independent, autonomous ghost. People create policies and laws that dictates how the market operates and dictate how housing policies are carried out. The second thing is sad, like, you know, like where people just go like, well, wait, like, you know, it's just really sad what's going on and like what can we really do about it. You know, I think a really major concerted effort to stop displacement has to involve active resistance and active participation behind people who directly benefit from the displacement of working class, primarily Black folks. And then the other one is that solutions have to come from government. Ultimately, I think that we need to begin thinking about our own personal uh, accounts, what type of ancestral wealth we have, what type of power and privilege we have. Many people on this call may go on to work in city, state, federal government. Who knows? Maybe there's a governor on this call. Maybe there's a future mayor on this call. Maybe there's even a president on this call. And so really being critical that we individually have ways to do things. And then the other thing that I want to mention before I go into what Jane places and how we see white supremacy and structural racism interacting housing is something I thought of a couple weeks ago. In white supremacy seeing patterns and ignoring them due to how they inconvenience folks. I really think that's a critical thing, that we see these patterns replicating themselves in the history of our country over and over and over again, right? We have the Civil War, we have Reconstruction. Reconstruction brings some progressive measures, and then it's squashed, right? We have the Civil Rights Movement, you know, progressive measures, like, you know, to remedy problems that have occurred for generations. And then we see the drug war, right? We see the drug war come in place, and now we have this massive level of gentrification pushing people out, and we have a healthcare system that's crumbling. And so I really think that like white supremacy is seeing these patterns and ignoring them and not taking proactive measures. So there's like advocacy, policy, organized work to do. But really, if we're going to get rid of some of these systems that are not healthy, that are wrecking people's lives, it takes active participation. So I really want that to stick, the white supremacy, seeing patterns and ignoring them because of how they inconvenience us on a personal, familial level, or economic level, right? Because in some ways, like, right, the money we invest in the stock market, like, you know, money goes in my 401k, right? Like, how does that benefit white supremacy? How am even I, as a Black man, benefiting from aspects of white supremacy as someone who's conventionally middle class and somewhat educated and has some level of social capital? Those are questions I ask, even as someone who's Black. So I really would like white folks to really question that. If I'm doing that questioning, I think we can all do that. So yeah, so Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainable Initiative is an organization that was founded to counter white supremacy, you know, the Prince Industrial Complex. We're a community land trust and housing rights organization. We were founded about 12 years ago by Shana Griffin, who is a legendary organizer, researcher, artist. Shayna does 1,000 different things. I'm not sure how, and she has many, many titles. She's brilliant. And then Bryce White, aka DJ Bryce Nice, and Isabel Barrios, and a few other folks who were really interested in like fighting against commodification of housing. And basically what we do is we have our community land trust where we build permanently affordable housing, but we also conduct policy advocacy and organizing work around all housing justice issues. I would definitely say that the difference between us, and not just organizations in our city, but organizations around the country, is that we take a much more post-capitalist analysis about housing, in terms of realizing that this current system that we have does not really work for housing people. And so that we need other solutions right now in order to do that. But yeah, so overall, I feel like there's so many different ways that we see structural racism show up in housing. Like I mentioned before, colonization in this country plays into how structural racism has taken hold. But like, some really basic overview of things are, you look at sort of like racist laws regarding who can own property where, slavery preventing Black folks from being able to access any capital to buy land. You look at the dispossession of land from indigenous people, and people being pushed along the trail tears to Oklahoma, and then having that land stolen. So there's many different ways we see this playing out, right? And we know that in our culture, in our country, the number one way to gain wealth is via land. That's the reason why you always see a tie-in with historically multi-generational wealthy people, and you see land is always there. There's always some equation of people inheriting land, selling land, maybe not in the current generation, but maybe 3-4 generations back, people have made lots of wealth. And I would challenge you to look at some of our city's politicians, especially in the past, and you'll see that many of them have either worked in development, or they may do development themselves via various LLCs. Just public knowledge, just take a look. And so I think one of the things that makes New Orleans really interesting is that because of the origin, the history of our city being founded by the French at the very early on part, you have like, mixed race and Black folks who are able to own land if they were free people of color. And so New Orleans, like, history segregation takes a very different turn than most places. But then, of course, you get like, Jim Crow, and things are definitively segregated in many neighborhoods. And so you look at redlining, how redlining, allow working class white folks to access loans, but only if they weren't in certain neighborhoods. And then you saw that places that Black people were forced to live in, those neighborhoods they could not get loans for, but wasn't still Black folks could move to other neighborhoods. And so therefore, right, you see this wealth gap continue. Even if people have the same jobs, there's been many studies that have shown that Davida can talk about, and done brilliant research. And I'm gonna actually post a link where you can see one of the reports that Davida co-wrote with Brian, our director of policy. You can see where people literally have lost out and where people have not accumulated so much wealth. So that's one major aspect of structural racism. You look at Hurricane Katrina, right? You look at the big 4 housing development, public housing developments, right? In the middle of this major storm, where you have these structures that were well built, still pretty much intact, all it would have taken was some gutting of the insides to get them back in operation. But due to neoliberal policies around redevelopment, and some pretty racist narratives about like, concentration of poor folks, they tore down these humongous housing complexes after one of the worst natural disasters in our country's history. And that to me is an example of structural racism, because all the units of affordable housing that our housing authority and city were mandated to rebuild, they haven't come close to replacing those units. Meanwhile, the city has become more and more expensive to live in. And so I think those are like some prime examples. But one that I would definitely like to end on is around laws, of course, because this is a law school panel, and evictions. Louisiana and the Deep South in general has some of the most aggressive eviction laws. And I will argue, and it's not original argument, lots of people made this argument, that the reason why is that's direct relationship Jim Crow. So the need to control people, the need to control viewing land as a source of income exclusive to like a need, a right that people should have the ability to live in safe structure, plays out heavily in the Deep South. And so consequently, there's been very few attempts to create more progressive laws because it's all about how, white patriarchs generate as much wealth as possible. And so that's one of the reasons why we have such regressive laws. And Louisiana ranks at the bottom, in my opinion, of deep southern states. And that continues to play out in our city, despite the fact that we have some of the most expensive or most expensive neighborhoods in the Deep South. It's not uncommon to see half a double shotgun go for $1,500 at this point in Tremaine. We don't have any laws to ring in costs, such as rent control. So
Frank, I'm so captivated by everything that's being talked about. I'm doing a horrible job moderating and timekeeping, so I'm just flagging that if you have just a minute or two left in your time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for giving me that reminder. So one of the things, just to wrap up, that we're doing to respond to that is we're embarking on 2 different campaigns. One called Right to Counsel. We want to ensure that every tenant going for eviction court facing any issue with their landlord has access to legal representation. That levels the playing field. We know from our own research in eviction court that when only 14% of tenants that had legal representation were evicted versus 63% of tenants who didn't have legal representation were evicted. So we can get tenants more access to legal representation. That is like leveling the playing field a little bit. And of course, there has to be more progressive efforts, but and welcome anyone to ask some questions more about what we're doing as well. And thank you to Davida for posting these links.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Frank. You've built so many connections from panel 1 this morning on structural racism in housing and planning. And thank you also for calling out the foundations of white supremacy that travel all throughout the policies we're talking about all day here, and for lifting that up in terms of housing policy. Again, before we turn to questions, I want to kick it over to Reverend Manning to share his thoughts for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll take the questions that are coming up from the audience. Reverend Manning, the Zoom floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Professor Finger, and to the Loyola Law School. It is so great to be with you, especially to my esteemed co-panelists, Derwyn, Bunton, and to Frank Southall as well too. Such a privilege always to be with both of you. I just want to begin to make it very clear, and I'm sure it has been made clear over the sessions that have preceded this one, that as we look at systemic racism and we look at how it affects healthcare and education and the criminal justice system and housing, we have to first admit that the system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. And if that has been iterated before, I take the opportunity to reiterate it, that the system of oppression and subjugation of Black and Brown people is doing exactly and working exactly how the forefathers and founders and implementers of colonization and capitalism intended for it to work. It is my feeling, and I will always stress that Black and brown people within the United States were never meant to prosper, were never meant to be successful, only being brought here for one reason, and that is to create economic wealth and generational wealth for the Europeans that came to these colonies and then developed it, and then also brought Africans here and utilized them for slave labor. And we have been seeing that for hundreds of years now, and it is continuing to work like a very well-oiled machine that continues to allow the oppression of Black and brown people. And so it is up to us to do everything in our everything possible within our reach, within our very platforms where we have been planted by God. I believe it is our moral mandate to break down this oppressive and sinful system of oppression that we are maneuvering in today. And so I'm very grateful and very thankful for what I see right now as a reckoning on systemic racism that is presently going on in our nation. It is absolutely a time when we've been brought to a new level of awareness of what is going on with systemic racism, and the dialogue that we're having in conversations such as these. As I've spoken with people who are older than myself, it's a dialogue that we've not seen happen on this level ever. And so we are seeing more willingness to discuss, to listen, and to learn. And this is only another representation of that happening. So I'm very thankful for that. And again, thank you for the honor of being invited. I do want to focus on several aspects of the discussion that's taken place. And one of those aspects that is very dear to my heart, as Professor Finger pointed out, is what is happening within our housing system. And we must, again, recognize when we talk about a system, we've got to talk about the compounding and the connectivity of all of these elements and all of these different facets of our society that we've talked about. They must work in tangent and in concert together in order to be successful, as I'm sure we already know. And so when we look at housing and what's going on, we have to look at it in the view and through the lens of the economic development within our city and the city planning. And so a couple of things I want to highlight. First, as a pastor, I often have a different view because I hear from my congregation members and what they're going through as well. One situation that was recently brought to me is of one of my congregation members who lives in the Ferret area. And if you go to Loyola, then you're familiar with the Ferret area. Has several popular venues for eating and has had several good bars and so forth on it that college students like to patronize. And so one of my church members living in that area has told me that the other day. She said, "Pastor, before Hurricane Katrina, my property taxes were literally $65 a year, $65 a year." And she said, "Now I've seen my property taxes increasingly rise since that time." And to recently, she just seen another spike in a property tax that was caused by the development and building of the new Rouses that is on Ferret Street. Because of that, her property taxes is now approximately $4,000 per year. Now, align that with the fact that she's owned her house. Her house was inherited from her father, and she's owned that house and lived there for many, many, many decades. And it is often approached by people that want to buy her property, and I'm sure renovate it, and I'm sure raise the rent at an exorbitant amount that would not allow for many people who are living below the living wage in New Orleans to be able to reside in. But right now, she is forced with being able to have to figure out how she's going to pay that $4,000 because Rouse has decided to build. And not only because of that, but because there are many, many, many new homes that are being built in that area and have continued to be built. And so my question becomes, where does the law and our policies begin to realize that there are what I refer to and what many others have begun to refer to as culture vultures? Those who have moved into communities, bought up land in order to create an enormous amount of Airbnbs within the area. And just using the Ferret Street area as an example, there are an exorbitant amount of Airbnbs within that area. And so we're even seeing within that community that it is rapidly changing, that the folks that are walking around aren't even from the area. And so it is now, and so consequently, people such as my congregant are being forced and afraid, living in fear that she is one day going to lose her home. And so at this very moment, I believe that one of the most important laws and policies that need to be changed is our land use policies that permit the Airbnbs to go without enforcement, that permit and do not put limitations on these spikes and these increases in property taxes that are forcing New Orleans residents to move further and further out of the city, that are causing them to forfeit their properties. And then when we look at that as well, too, we have to look at the fact that I've worked with several groups that have been approaching the city about putting limitations on who can buy or purchase by way or bid rather on properties that go up for auction when such properties are forfeited because of failure to pay property taxes. We all know that, or most of us know that when that happens and these houses go up for auction, there are many people that come from the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, North, in order to bid on these homes and then purchase them for little to nothing, and then turn them over, flip them, turn these double shotgun houses into single homes, and now purchase the home for $60,000 and now turn around and sell it for $450,000, causing the property taxes of everyone in the neighborhood to rise at the same time. There must be limitations on that. And so what organizations that I've worked with in different community groups have been advocating for is that our city would see that we have a housing crisis. I do not believe that the city has come to realize the magnitude of the housing crisis that we are now in. And so when we look at the properties that are now on the city's books and that come up for auction, we have to be able to designate that people who want to house what have been traditionally known as the homeless, but those of us who are working with these individuals know that a better terminology is houseless, because the word homeless often comes with a stigma and comes with certain stereotypes that are simply not appropriate, because the population and the criteria or how people who are houseless look is very much different than the way it has looked for decades. And so what we're advocating for is that there would be a certain number of houses that are up for $0 amount to bid on, that are up for $1 amount to bid on, so that then people who are working to ensure that people who do not earn a living wage, people who have to work 2 and 3 jobs, people that have been made to be houseless, can have the opportunity to be given these homes, to be able to renovate them, and also at the same time learn a trade, that will be considered as apprentices to those who are electricians or plumbers or carpenters, that they would be given these homes and then would be given be able to then renovate them, and then they would be given first priority to be housed in these homes. This is something that I believe needs to be changed immediately right now. And I believe that it is within our city's power to be able to create laws and policies that would do this immediately. One of the things that we see, and I see as a pastor, is that as the city develops and gives way and deference to gentrification and those that would buy up land for that purpose, we are continuing to see that there are no laws that also ensure that when new homes are built or new properties are developed, that also grocery stores, not just corner stores that have a little bit of produce somewhere in a counter, but grocery stores that have fresh produce in them where people can shop that is also made mandatory by law or by policy, that they are also built as well too. One of the things that we often see in our community is not only that people are housing insecure, that they are also food insecure, because we have not done an appropriate job of making sure by law or by policy that these grocery stores are built within the communities as well. And then real quickly, as we focus on criminal justice, we have to go back to the fact that our communities are, and I'm sure we all agree, are over-policed. And one of the things we have to talk about is a redirection of funding. And we need to talk about investing in our communities. And that links us to education. And so one of the things that I've been advocating for within our community is that we would set up vocational institutions, places where young people who are Black and brown, who do not have it, who it is not in their best interest for to go to college, neither financially or even socially, because it would cause a void within their family structure and just a lot of times financially prohibitive for them to go, that we would invest in a vocational school right in our urban core that allows young people to be duly trained in such vocations as I mentioned before, as plumbing, as electrical work, as carpentry, so that they can earn gainful employment. And then even as we talk about the mitigation of climate change, which is also a necessary conversation that we must have, because that also is adding to the housing crisis that we're seeing right here in our community, even as we see that there are evacuees from Hurricane Laura in the Lake Charles area that are still residing in downtown hotels, incidentally, who do not have adequate bottles of water and have not been given opportunities to eat 3 times a day like most of us. And so we have to talk about the fact that when we look at the mitigation of climate change, we also have to look at the opportunity to invest in green jobs, in jobs where young people, young Black and brown people, will be educated and trained on how to build such things as solar panels. That is an industry that will be booming, and we have to invest within. And so when we talk about economic development and finally, let me just go to healthcare. One of the things that we're seeing in our community is a lack of treatment for the trauma that young people, especially young Black and brown people, have been dealing with for many decades, especially since Hurricane Katrina. I think that we have vastly underestimated the traumatic impact of Hurricane Katrina. I've spoken with many youth who have told me we never even talked about it in school. They've told me it was just a conversation that was brushed over. And now 15 years out, we are now dealing with the repercussions of that unaddressed trauma. And so when we talk about healthcare and the laws concerning healthcare and how we care for people who are dealing with such trauma, we have to look and expect and advocate that those laws would change, that there would be drop-off or drop-in centers that people would be afforded to, that they can drop in and have their healthcare needs met. And then we, on top of that, we have to talk about the fact that Medicaid is intended to keep people poor, that the laws that qualify people for things like Medicaid and food stamps also need to change as well too. And so we have to immediately also advocate that within our urban core, where Black and brown people predominantly reside, that we have to set up appropriate places where people can be evaluated, and that people can, not so much for medication, but if that is needed, then we need to be able to supply the medication as well too, and be able to set up proper counseling services so that people will not act out in negative ways as they are dealing with trauma. And so I'm going to wrap up there. I don't want to take up too much time, but again, I'm very grateful and thankful that we are having this very important conversation, and that issues begin to rise to the surface that we can address immediately. And finally, what I want to say is that as a pastor, I understand that from Scripture, the poor are always going to be with us. That is no doubt. And so what we have to figure out is how to deal with the fact that our system is set up on a for-profit basis. That the capitalism has made it such that we have given favor to those who want to profit off of poverty. We're at a point to where being poor is a crime, and that has to change. That the framework that has allowed that to prosper has to change. And so, so as we look at the fact that the poor will always be with us, we have to learn how to care for the least of those in our society. As Matthew 25 says, those who have nothing to eat, nothing to drink, those who have no home, we have to figure out a better way to care for them so that we are not, and I believe the way that we figure that out is by dismantling racism in every system that adds to the placing of the knee upon the neck of brown and Black people within our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Manning. So fitting, I think, that you are the closing panelist for this incredible symposium today, because you have brought together so many different ideas, so many issue areas, so many policy ideas that can be realized if we have the political will. And all three of you talking first from Derwyn Bunton about the political expression, from Frank Southall about the white supremacy, and from Reverend Manning talking about so many different issue areas, as you did so well to educate us in pulling these ideas together. I think I'm going to try to push, if I can, if that's okay, Jillian, to try to, there are a number of questions in the Q&A. Many of them have actually been addressed by the speakers. There is one that asks about how can you be a progressive DA in a carceral system? And I would expand that to say, how can you be progressive in working in any of our systems? What we have seen so clearly today is how broken all of our systems are. How can you be a progressive social justice, anti-racist advocate in our systems with the way they are currently set up? Derwyn Bunton, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I didn't know who would take it, but the short answer is you got to have a thick skin and a strong stomach to do this work. Because you're going to be swimming upstream a little bit, and by a little bit I mean a lot. And so, how do you do it? One, learn the system. You have to read, pay attention to the laws, look at what is not just on paper, but off paper. Culturally, how are folks behaving? We have, I've had a lawyer threatened with contempt because they reached for the code of criminal procedure. That is the book that governs what we do. And the judge said, if you grab that book, I will hold you in contempt. And that tells you a little bit about the culture that you're often finding yourself in. So how you do it is first learn your craft, and then you got to figure out and find and develop strategies for making the changes. You know, one of the things we did was we began to look in the broader community. And with that, I'll say folks who have been feeling the brunt of this system are folks with a lot of answers to how to deal with it. The folks closest to the problem are the folks closest to the solution. And so when we need to listen and pay attention to our communities who are most at risk and affected, and then come up with strategies, help them navigate based on the knowledge you have now acquired, so that you can change the systems inside out and outside in, because I don't think you can't do one or the other. You got to do both. And so that means figuring out how you build capacity in your community to go to Baton Rouge to change laws, and how you think creatively as an advocate to, you know, maybe sue a judge or two, or sue the state of Louisiana to make folks do the right thing. And then when you do that, you'll have the community as wind at your back. And when the community does stuff, you need to be the wind at their back. And sometimes we're the muscle, like we're the lawyers. One of the jokes I used to tell is, I've got over 60 lawyers in my office. I can make trouble for anybody, is what I say. And community should not, should learn from a lot of us what we should be telling them. They are not powerless. In fact, they are quite powerful when focused, educated, and trained, and capacity is built.
Great, thank you so much. Would either of our two panelists like to jump in on this one?
You know, I just want to say that I think the power structure and understanding needs to shift. In terms of the DA and whoever it is that wants to operate in a progressive fashion within this present system of systemic racism that we live in, is to understand that the power lies with the people, that there are so many stakeholders and institutions that we fail to utilize because they are not promoted and as being useful. And so, you know, specifically, even as a pastor and many coalitions that I serve on, a lot of times we're just not called upon as often as we should be. To say, you know, let's get you at the round table. Let's give you a seat where you're part of the decision making. So I think that is one of what should be one of the primary goals, to get stakeholders and people who can be impactful in making such decisions that will change the system, present at the table and saying that you are valuable and useful to this discussion, and getting the normal actors and who are usually at the table, giving them a little bit of a backseat, and giving those who people do tend to lean on towards more, such as pastors, a more predominant place.
Thank you, Reverend Manning. And Frank, from the housing perspective, from your vantage point, to be a progressive advocate, to be an anti-capitalist, anti-consumer, and the ideas you discuss, how can one do that in the present systems that are set up in broken and other ways?
So yeah, I think a lot about, that's a really great question. I think a lot about our personal capital we have, our financial capital, our social capital. How are we using that in concrete individual ways to affect change? This sounds really, it can sound silly, but I believe wholeheartedly that if we are doing this work as individuals, then when it comes to time for us to do this work collectively, it's much more easier, right? I think a lot of times we displace this work off and go like, oh, I'm a part of a group and this work will happen. But I think we really arrive at solutions when individually we go like, how can I take a chunk of that? So one example in terms of financial capital in Jane Place, we've had people who have profited off of the redevelopment, or I shouldn't say profit off. They would have profited off, but people who have brought houses years ago in quickly gentrifying neighborhoods have then, when they sold houses, helped to finance the growth of our community land trust by donating money, because they're like, I didn't intend to make profit off this, and this is my way to give back to this community land trust. Likewise, not everyone has financial capital. So how are you using your social capital in terms of your skills? Can you help with getting someone back their security deposit back so that they can have a little bit more wealth from a landlord that may have stolen it, but because they have some legal help, they can get it back. And it's a pretty easy thing to learn if you're a law student or whomever. But for a lot of working class folks, it's very daunting. So there's many different ways I think participate, but I really think critically, not just about collective action, but individual action. When you figure out your place in the individual piece, you will be able to work with groups much more better and efficiently.
Great. Thank you so much, Frank. I just want to apologize as the moderator that we didn't have time to get to more questions, but I think you'll agree with me that our speakers' perspectives were completely captivating. And I, again, want to lift up our student leadership who has pulled this program together. I believe our BALSA president, Michaela Graves, will be closing out the day. But I just want to add my perspective that our job as lawyers and law students is not just to dream, but is to have the tools and to have the self-reflection and the emotional intelligence to understand what is going on in terms of the structural racism of our system, our laws, all of our legal institutions, and to acquire the knowledge in order to effectuate the change, to know when to step back, to know when to listen, and to know when and how to be an effective community lawyer. So I just, again, want to lift up this entire day for bringing together so many different issues and so many different ideas. And I truly hope it's the step that will be the catalyst to many more such conversations in our community. And thank you all again to our very distinguished speakers for joining us all day, and in particular for this panel that we're on right here now.
Thank you, Dean Finger, and thank all of you for that amazing panel. Like Dean Finger said, my name is Michaela Graves. I'm the president of Loyola chapter of the Black Law Student Association, and I'll be delivering the closing remarks. So today we were reminded of the structural inequities that African Americans face in nearly every institution. With this symposium, it was our goal to first highlight the historical connection between laws and policies and the current structural racism in the United States. And secondly, identify the changes needed in various areas of law and policy, such as housing, city planning, criminal and juvenile justice, mass incarceration, and education. However, let's not allow this to just be a stimulating day with great talks. We hope that this symposium has lit a fire in you and brought you to realize that structural racism has created complex yet often hidden barriers that make it harder for Black people to succeed by creating laws and policies that may seem racially neutral on their face, but have insidious roots. We hope that you have come to realize that it's up to each one of us to take part in the necessary changes stated today, because what's at stake is too costly. Only then can we ensure that these laws are changed and equity is attained for all people. On behalf of Loyola, BALSA, Law Review, and the Journal of Public Interest, we would like to sincerely thank our keynote speaker, Devin Carbato, along with all of our panelists who have so flawlessly articulated the structural changes needed in various areas of law and policy. We would like to thank our moderators for guiding the discussion, Brian Huddleston, who helped us host our webinar, as well as Professor Southall, who worked closely with us to put this event together. We also like to give thanks to Michelle Morlier, our business manager, for giving us the tools to put on such a great event. And without all of you, this event would not have been possible or nearly as successful. And just a reminder for the attorneys who are seeking CLE credit for attending this event, please email your name and bar number to Malia. And for the law students who are seeking skill credits, please remember you must write a 300-word essay and send it to Professor Linares. I want to thank you all for attending, all of our attendees for attending, and for the time and dedication that you put into this effort, and for the work that is yet to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.